Okay, perfect. Well, it's 10 o'clock and welcome everybody to Signi Chats. We got to make sure that you all have your coffee. Otherwise, I'll have to change the name. We don't want to do that. So I'm Shane Treadway, founder of Signi, and going to be your host today. And the goal of our program is that we really want to try to connect a diversity of informed voices, including yours, to grow our cultural intelligence so that we can, kind of solve complex cultural challenges. Culture is super complex, even though the role of culture is to make things easier. But when you want to try to change culture and engage it and influence, we find out that it's very complex. So our format today includes our special guest, Phillip McKenzie, and we also have our partner consultants, and we have you guys, our guests, who will give input at the end. If you could, in the meantime, guests, just be sure that your mic's muted, that the video is off, so that we just have the panelists front, who I am going to introduce right now. First, just wanted to let you know that we are going to be sinking our teeth into a very big question. It's way bigger than we'll be able to chew on and swallow today, but I'm sure that we're going to have some big insights and some really good ideas and some methodologies that we can use. Cultural challenges. All right. So the question today is, how could we find and fix deep cultural problems? Sometimes unseen, it comes from our mind, is how our mind kind of makes sense of things. But how can we get our hands on the pieces of culture, the gears and the wheels of it, so that we could actually do something or influence, create change, that help resolve conflicts, do some new creative things, solve creative problems. So that's what we're going to be looking at. The answers to these ideas and the questions that are spurred from them, really think are what are going to attain peace and restoration and the unity that hopefully we are all looking for, and for the justice. We're definitely feeling and have felt for a long time in human society that there is, injustice can happen pretty quick. And when that gets institutionalized, when the powers are just controlling that and reproducing that, that's a problem. We have opportunities to jump into that, to fix that at different levels in our societies. So we want to take advantage of those opportunities. And that's also part of what's happening today. First, I want to introduce I don't know the order that you're looking at, but you can see the names. We have Annette Vanderveld. She's joining us from the New York area. She's originally from the Netherlands. She's an expat coach and a relocation consultant. She's also a founder of Expatriate Assistance, and she's a Signi consultant. We also have Vanita Balasubramanian. She is joining us from Germany, right?
That's right.
All right,
That's
cool.
right.
Joining us from Germany, she is a corporate trainer. She's founder of Viva Intercultural. She's a Signi consultant. We also have with us Tanya. All right. She is, though, a fellow Californian, Tanya Shaikh, and she is also going to be chiming in. She's also a Signi consultant. She's our researcher. So welcome, team of panelists. And our special guest today, thank you for joining us, is Phillip McKenzie. Phillip, I think you're joining us from New York, from the Bronx,
yeah,
is that
from
right?
Brooklyn, from Brooklyn.
From Brooklyn, that's right, from Brooklyn.
The planet called Brooklyn.
The planet called Brooklyn. All right, very cool. Well, nice to have you with us. Phillip McKenzie is an anthropologist, a cultural anthropologist, a fellow cultural anthropologist. That's what really drew me to Phillip. All right. He's also an organizational advisor. He's a prolific writer to Phillip through writing that I caught in Media Village. So you can check out his writing in Media Village. He also has a page there that you guys can link up to and follow Phillip McKenzie. He uses his quantitative background and experience as a former Goldman Sachs trader, and he combines that with his qualitative understanding of societies through his anthropological studies and expertise there. All right, so he's traveled and worked extensively abroad. He's also designed and curated what's called the Influencer Conference, and he's consulted Newman on their internal and external cultural challenges and branding strategies. So with no further ado, Phillip, Thank you for joining
Thank
us,
you
my
so
friend.
much for having me. I'm so encouraged to be part of conversations like this, and it's great to hear that. Obviously, global situation. People are in some of my favorite places. I lived in Amsterdam for a while. I lived in Berlin. So it's great to see and hear that folks are in some of those locations as we speak. So I'm really excited to be here. So I'm not going to spend too much time like kind of with gratitude, even though gratitude is very important. It's how we should start every gathering, because I want to leave plenty of time for
That's
discussion.
right.
So I'm ready
Yeah,
when
that's right.
you're
We do
ready.
have a relatively short period of time, and is to avoid one talking head. We have sort of multiple heads going, but our guest speaker is our main point of focus, and we want to understand your points of view, your contributions. We want to be able to dig that out in any way we could, kind of experiences around that. That's what we want to do. So I just want to kick off with kind of a starting question that's interesting to me and to you, I'm sure. So how does sort of that keen cultural eye, or having cultural competency, cultural intelligence, how does that help us um, frame and diagnose cultural
Yeah.
problems?
Culture is everything. And I'm biased because I work and functioning in culture spaces. But even when I didn't, which is why my traditional experiences in corporate America, both before I went to business school, I worked in banking. When I left business school, I worked at Goldman Sachs. All of those experiences, though people would consider them to be traditional experiences, were informed by the culture that was around me. Every time we walk into a space, we bring we are. So I brought the embodiment of a, firstborn American, grew up in New York and Brooklyn in the 70s and 80s. I brought all of that into every experience that I had. Those values were part of me. And so my personal experience is part of why culture is so important, because we all do that on every given day. All of our experiences are based up of these informal and informal ways in which we interact. So, there's been plenty of definitions around culture. If anyone were to Google a definition of culture, hundreds of them, if not more. And, I use a very basic definition that culture consists of the shared values that are both informal and informal, formal and formal, that are manifested through people, places, and things and organizations. It's which we make sense of the world. And we can't make sense of our surroundings. We can't start to unravel complex challenges if we don't have a strong basis in culture.
Yeah, for sure, man. I like how you say that bringing ourself to the table. I think sometimes too with culture, culture can kind of blind us because it's it's how we make sense of the world, and so we assume a lot of times, particularly if we're in a dominant culture, that the way that we make sense of the world is the sense of the world. And that's different. Where Phil, where have you found kind of like your sense and the sense of the the community that you engaged with kind of had some, maybe some conflict, or what experiences have you had where like, wow, this is really is we're in different worlds?
Yeah, I think, not to put too fine a point on it, it's ever since I've been alive and known sentient, being a Black person living in America. You feel you exist in two worlds at once. You exist in the culture, which is really how you survive. If you don't understand the dominant culture, as a Black person and other ethnic groups, minority groups, could cost you your life. You see that with the recent news cycle, which is a seemingly never-ending story, but it's a story that's part of how we all got here. So I think that's the most obvious way in which you are in conflict with the dominant culture just by virtue of your existence. Who you are is deemed dangerous, and that's a reality.
Yeah, actually, the documentary 13th night with my wife, and I had done some reading on the structural violence, and again, from the dominant perspective, from a white perspective, there's for that. There's no sense of what that means, because there had never been an experience in my life where I had felt that. Right? If there was any violence against me, it was based on sort of a one-to-one conflict with someone who you're just having some tension with, but never a feeling that where you're going, you're sort of starting off on the defensive all of the time. Starting off having to defend yourself, starting off having to prove something. Yeah, and honestly, just can't imagine. And to watch that movie and to see that background is it's just amazing. As far as our panelists go, have there been any of you on the panel who have maybe the same thing, have gone into experiences where there's been maybe a lot of disconnect, and maybe even a feeling of, because of your identity, whether it's ethnic identity, racial identity, gender, that you felt like you were sort of at a disadvantage? How about you, Vinita? Have you ever experienced anything like that, or how has been your experience as a female in the corporate world?
I was just thinking about it. Fortunately, anytime I go into the corporate world, I've been hired to go in. So there's a lot of aggression sometimes, which is directed not against me as a human being, but as the group I'm going to be explaining. So if say a German group, a team has been having a lot of trouble with their Indian counterparts, then I am seen as a representative. So I must say I've been very, very lucky, and I can't even begin to imagine what it must be, to walk a mile in Phillip's moccasins.
For sure. Phillip, you have invested in your life to become super influential, engaged, professional, all of those things that we're all working toward. But where do you see the pieces? What are the pieces of the culture that, like, this is a problem?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a challenge, because I think the problems in the culture are baked to it from the beginning, right? And the more you know the history, I think the more obvious these things can become. I think the challenge is that we don't really know the history. We know the brand, right?
Interesting.
So I think American Apple has a very incredible brand. Everywhere you go around the world, people have a very clear perspective of what they think of as America, right? Because America has done a very good job of putting its best foot forward in terms of rhetoric. So folks know, like, land of the home, and, land of the free and home of the brave, and these ideas that the roads are paved with gold. And it's part of what got those immigrants who chose to come here, right? So the massive immigration that we saw in the late 19th century and early 20th century was because of those stories, those narratives, those Horatio Alger stories of the shoeshine boy made good, right? Those sort of pulp fic types of ideas, the ideas of manifest destiny and the lone individual cowboy looking out onto the horizon. And those simple stories continue to this day to reinforce how we think about the way in which we do business, right? So the cowboy of yesteryear is now the venture capitalist of today, right? The conquering new territory of yesteryear is the disrupting of industry. So are the narratives and the stories that we tell ourselves that are very seductive to the world when you're thinking about America. Absent the history, and the history is part of the culture. So you realize that those stories are based on theft and exploitation of indigenous people and the enslavement of Africans brought to America to create all those things, right? That Asians, primarily Chinese, built those railroads, right? Like all street. And that's not to say that everything that happened is bad, but if you're going to understand code, you have to contextualize everything that's going on in order for it to make sense. If you don't do that, then you're just left with the brand story. And the brand story is an incomplete story. And so you're constantly retelling things for the first time. So the events of the past few weeks feel new to the majority culture because they've never learned that this is how the country was built, you know, in the first place. And so that's why culture is important, you know, because brands operate, you know, to just take a very business example, they operate within this culture. So if they don't understand it, they'll often make and remake the same mistakes over and over and over again, because we will view it through the lens of insensitivity rather than through the lens of understanding.
From our panel, are there any questions lingering from our panel?
Hi, I'm Laura Lynn. I have a few questions. I'm trying to wrestle and grapple with all of this in our world happening right now. And I love how you talked about the cowboy of yesteryear is the venture capitalist of today. What is it in Black culture do you think that we are missing, that we need to educate ourselves more? Is there any one specific part? We know we need to educate ourselves on the history. I'm hearing that quite a bit. You know, the history is what we need to know. But I also feel like there's a block of some sort in us listening. And maybe we need to take up the culture of listening. But I'd love for you to expand on that a little more.
Sure. I think I love the way the question is phrased. So my answer, because I'm a big language person. I think those who either have conversations with me or read my stuff, I am obsessed about language and how we put things together. So my answer will kind of break the question apart a little bit. And just, again, speaking from an American perspective, because I do understand that there are people who are global in their perspective, right? So the American story and background is not the only story, but I'm going to answer the question from an American context. And what I would suggest to folks is that Black history is American history. The two are intertwined with one another in the same way DNA is intertwined with itself, right? You can't really separate one from the other. So I think it's important when we think about the way in which we've been taught history, that if we don't fill in those gaps, if you kind of remember that scene in Jurassic Park where they're describing how they made the dinosaurs, kind of filled in the DNA blocks with like frog DNA and all that, you know, that little video showed in the first Jurassic Park. I think like American history is like that. We have like this DNA strand, but there's all these missing pieces that we now need to fill in. And it creates blocks because we don't really understand it and know it. So what I suggest to folks is get a richer context of how all this stuff fits together, because then people's reactions will start to make a little bit more sense, right? And also I would emphasize, because I had this conversation on LinkedIn a little bit, that really understand any culture isn't just about the trauma of the situation, right? It's not just thinking about Black this lens of, oh, well, what if they endured through history, and let's try to understand it. I think that's useful, but I think it's also useful to just understand like just regular life, right? The same things that like, oh, we all do the same things, right? We all fall in love, fall out of love, have kids, get angry at our kids, wish we never had kids, things that we all do that are just part of like the human experience. The more we understand and embrace those things, the more like progress. I think one of the challenges we face is that we live very separate lives. So in a city like New York, people think, oh, New York is so multicultural, there's different cultures here. But New York is super segregated. And I could say that because I've lived here all my life, right? People in New York, we ride the train together and we be at the same deli, but we don't really like hang out, right? Like I could go out before COVID when things were locked down, choose on any given night to go out in New York and end up at a place where I'm the only Black person. Or conversely, I could end up at a spot where there's only Black people, right? and I think every group can do that. And there's nothing intrinsically wrong with it. Sometimes we just want to be around where we feel the most comfortable. But at the same time, when that becomes sort of institutionalized and normalized, we realize that we don't really know each other. Personal level, if I think about these last few days, weeks or whatever, I think jokingly, I talked to other friends and I'm like, I never knew I was this popular among my white friends, right? Because I'm the only Black person they know, and I think that's the thing. Like if I've been coming to your house for 6, 7, 8 years for your dinner party or your whatever, and I'm usually the only Black, that's an opportunity for you to interrogate why. Because I know a lot of you guys, but you guys know me.
Yeah.
So it's just an interesting thing to kind of think about. But this is all part of making sense of culture. Yeah. It doesn't always have to be race. It can be anything, right? If you want to understand how all this stuff fits together, you have to be voracious in your curiosity to just think about stuff and try to see, well, do these examples make sense to me? If they don't, why? And then you go down some rabbit hole and maybe that leads to an insight somewhere down the road.
I love that. Man. I love the that idea. And it's like based on our science type thinking. Like sometimes we just don't stop and ask why. Why is the sun bright? We just every day the sun's bright. It's not curious. So I love that idea of having curiosity, particularly in relationships, in asking those questions. Why is it that there's only one Black person at the table or one person of color in this group? Like why?
Everything is a choice, right? Even science is choices. That culture is so important. Culture is everywhere, right? Like why do we have like Viagra and why do we have like baldness solutions, right? Because men cut the checks, right? Men care about certain things just historically. And so those things get the attention, those things get the funding, right?
Yeah, that's where the market is, man. That's
and everything else, we live in a world of pandemic, depending on where you are. It's more serious than in other places, but I've seen ink wasted on, the future of work is being at home now and it's perfect. And I'm like, perfect for who? Perfect for what? Under what circumstances, right? Like, is everybody's technological connectivity the same? For families that have children where every kid has their own phone and every kid has their own tablet and there's multiple computers, that's fantastic. But for families that don't live in that environment where digital is scarce, that's not a viable alternative, right? when women are still expected to do the lion's share of the responsibility of raising children and educating them, and their working jobs, that's not a viable future, right? When men don't want to, I was about to say bad words, when men don't want to do their fair share and expect that, I might make more, so I make the decision. Well, why do you make more in the first place, asshole? It's like, none of that's right. And all of that is culture, and all of that is choices. None of this is the way it has to be. It is not, these are not rules of nature. It's not gravity. The boat will fall at the same rate because that's a natural rule of science. All the rest of this is decisions arbitrarily made by human beings, which means we can change it into something else. But we can't change it if we don't understand why we're going forward with these decisions in the first place. Yeah. So I'll open it up to more questions from you and also the panel. I'm not here to editorialize.
No, you are here. You are here to editorial. You're here to lay it out for us, to give us something to chew on, to think about. And if anything, we're just going to kind of bounce that around in our brain. Annette, I know you're living in New York. You may have a couple of things on your mind for what Phillip was talking about. Do you have something on your mind?
Phillip, you keep saying the question for me translates to what is stopping us? What is, why don't we have any, you said you were the only person in at a white dinner party. What systems? What has made it that way? And if we know what has made it that way, then we can break down that what. And of course, there's a lot of what made it that way. But what is the first thing that we should ask? What has made it that we're in this situation? What's the first thing we should ask that we can then break down?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of fear, right? All of our then chain of decisions start to follow particular patterns. So there's stories that we tell ourselves, and if you start to tell yourself another story, it's now a moment of being afraid, right? Because we're now also talking about resources. So I think about abundance versus scarcity. How many times have we, from growing up, think about, survival of the fittest and all these ideas that we tell ourselves? We use the so-called natural world to justify our unnatural decision processes, right? So we use these examples and say, oh, well, Darwin said it's survival of the fittest. So if that community isn't doing well, it's just because that's the way nature is, right? They're just not as equipped to do well. Of course, women can't enter the workplace. They're hysterical and they can't handle it. And let's build fainting couches because Victorian ladies are delicate and they'll collapse, right? Like, these are just mythologies, right? But those mythologies become the way in which we build institutions. And when you don't confront the fear-based way in which we've told those stories, you just reinforce them. And when you're in the scarcity piece now, people look at it rather than expanding the pie. They think of it as taking away an opportunity from me, right? Me being the person who's in power. So, well, of course we can't have more diversity because so many good people are going to lose their jobs, right? Where are they going to work now? Like, I don't know, maybe they'll do something else, or maybe they sucked, right? Like, maybe that's the reality, that they weren't good in the first place, right? Not all of them, but many of them. We all know how institutions work. Like, how many people got jobs because they knew somebody or went to the right school or did this or did that? Like, the idea of meritocracy is another myth. There's no meritocracy. Like, how's that possible? How could there be a meritocracy? Just look around. Are these the best people? I doubt it. right? Like that doesn't seem likely to me. So I think that's what we have to confront is fear and these mythologies around resources. The world has enough for all of us, but we've chosen to allocate towards scarcity rather than abundance because that's easier to keep people in power and deny others what we should just have, and that's why the pandemic has been so instructional, because all the mythologies about budgets and deficits and money and how it works, we realize it's all a myth, right? Oh, we don't have enough money for that. Wow, seems like it, right? $2 trillion, $4 trillion just appeared out of nowhere. How that are not editorial points about politics, is about stories.
And it's a motor that's working a certain way, and the gas goes in here, and the wheel turns, and the pollution pumps out here,
and all of these things have competing narratives, right? Everything is a choice, and we have to surface the narratives that build a better society for all of us. So our culture should reinforce those ideas. It's why I emphasize using language that when I was coming to school and business school was the soft skills language, right? It was the language that we considered to be weak. Like, oh, why are we talking about teamwork? That has no place in corporate America. Like, what are you talking about? That's craziness, So I'm sure we're getting questions. So let's take questions or add more dialogue from the group.
Yeah, I was thinking
while I drink water, I have no coffee.
Yeah, that's okay. We can do a water chat too, no problem. Better for you. How about you, Tanya? What's sparking your as you listen to this conversation?
Quite a bit. As a fellow young person of color in America, growing up, I was also felt like I was in two different worlds. And then also growing up in a post 9/11 America was difficult. So growing up now and being married and thinking about establishing a family, I think about what am I going to tell my kid and how do I interpret history to them? So when you're talking about the system and how do we break the system and filling in these gaps in this DNA that we have all together, we educate myself and how do I unlearn the things that I learned in school that don't make a lot of sense because they didn't provide a full context or all of the information from different perspectives. And I guess my question is, how do we go about that? I'm reading more different scholars and different fields, but what can more?
Yeah, I think we all do the best we can, right? Like part of this journey and using like different language and breaking down narratives is also to have compassion for one another. That we, like I said at the beginning, like we all come into these rooms bringing our whole selves, which means that there is no test of perfection. I don't expect everyone, because I don't know everything, right? So the first thing I want to emphasize is that I am not suggesting that I have read everything or know everything. That, like, far from it. I got stacks and stacks of more stuff that I think in a lifetime I will ever be able to work through. And I think we're all faced with that, right? And these past few weeks where people are inundating us with lists, things to watch, and it's like it's crazy, exactly, right? Like we would have to be glued in front of our TVs all day, and then another day spend all reading or right. It's just an impossible journey. But I think it's a lifetime journey, right? So we need to be compassionate with others, in terms of meeting you where you are, and letting us go through this together. There's language and things and terms that I never thought 5 years ago, right? It just wasn't in my mind to think about, much less when I was 16, much less when I was 10. This is an evolution, right? And we got to be willing to take that I think if our values are ones that emphasize, love and compassion, justice, it will lead us toward better choices, right? Because if I'm confronted with something that is new to me, I'm a little bit more to entertain the idea than to just shut it down.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why I think like values are so important. It's not that we're gonna end up at this perfect place, because that place doesn't exist. But we just gotta do better, right? That's, if I think about the text when I was in grade school, they were terrible, right? And then if I look at the textbooks that, my younger nieces had, they were a little better, right? Then I'm sure if I were to pull open a text, a little better still, right? So we constantly kind of go through that iteration, right? And that's okay. I don't feel like we should like flagellate ourselves for not having like the perfect thing, right? Because we're going to learn new things, and then our books will get better, our films will get better, and we'll just keep making progress. We got to remember, we got to fight for that progress, right? Because we didn't get the things we got because people just thought it was a good idea, right? Like people resisted it, and they continue to resist it. That's why we have to be so adamant to fight this fight. There's folks on the other side that are actively working against us, right? Like, as much as COVID is a crisis of health, for many people around the world, it's an opportunity to continue to do and emphasize terrible things. We see that all around the world, that people who have a different perspective on the world are in like pandemic, right? They're emboldened by racial conflict in the United States and other places, because they use it to justify their arguments, and we have to make better arguments.
Vanita, I know you had a question. Vanita, your question will be the final one of our panelists, and I'm sure we have a million more that we can ask, and then we'll jump into some of our guests. Go ahead, Vanita.
Now, to you, Philip. When I listened to your idea of this brand, this American brand, land of the brave, and so on, it would interest me to know whether, as a Black American, do you share some of this brand, or is your, if I may say so, a Black brand of America, which in some way intersects with this mainstream picture? And does it diverge from that? I mean, obviously it diverges in many ways, but where do you see this brand for, being American, being a Black American, later, this vision of a country which you belong to, like everybody else in that country?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question. It's probably worthy of a thesis that I won't be able to do justice to in the moment I have. What I will say is that if you look at like contemporary culture, many people have discussed this idea, right? Frantz Fanon, who's a famous anti-racial scholar and colonial scholar, wrote, Black Skin, White Mask. He talks about this idea of living in this duality. Langston Hughes wrote a very famous poem, we wear the idea of duality. We have called code switching, where you talk one way with the folks in your community and act another way in the dominant culture. So from that perspective, I think these are ideas that have been explored by far more brilliant minds than my own. My personal experience is similar in the sense that, yes, obviously I'm American because I was born here, though my family was not. right? So I'm already coming into a perspective where I'm bringing that another culture into an existing culture here in the United States, right? On top of that, of course, as a American born here, I have American privileges. Every time I travel with my passport, I'm like, no one asks me questions. It's pretty easy to move through borders with an American passport. So there's that duality where it's tough at home, sometimes great abroad, and we've seen that with, you know, many Americans have experienced that, even going back to World War I, when American soldiers that were Black went to fight in World War I in segregated army units, and many didn't. They were like, you know, we kind of like France. It's not like Mississippi, you know. But those who did come back and then were forced back into a segregated system in the 1919 summer, that's famously called the Red Summer, because there was a record number of lynchings. Many of those men that were lynched in their army uniforms. So I think that's the duality of our experience. And I didn't experience, but I've had my own experience. And that's how we manage that, you know. Long answer, but like I said, maybe that touches on some of it.
Yeah, fantastic.
Thank you very much.
Fantastic. Yeah, let's open it up right now. We've got Jean Marcos. You had a question. You can feel free to unmute yourself, and even, yeah, there you are. Hey, Jean, nice to see you.
Hello, everyone. Hello, Shane. Well, thank you, Philip, for this courageous speech, and almost you're sharing with us a lot of your personal background and your academical background and your personal story. So I appreciate that. I think that is very courageous in today's world. Actually, calling from France, short introduction, time for coffee here because it's almost 8 p.m. So it's more the time for a beer, but still I'm very happy to be here. And again, I want to thank Shane for inviting me. This is really great. And I would have so many questions to ask you, Philip. I do share some of these insights about belonging to two or several in the same dominant culture, because myself, I have also background from another country. I was been raised in Argentina, but I've been living in France now for half of my life. So I completely understand how different narratives somehow or sometimes tend to collide one into another, right? And my question goes in that sense, right? I fully agree with you with this. The basic cultural perspective and landscape, it's created with stories, right? With stories that people are telling to one another, and the story with capital H, the history of a certain country is not created by everyone, it's created in a certain way. And as saying, textbooks tend to incorporate more and more minorities, stories, and of course the history with a capital H again. But I'm concerned, but only just to problematize this notion, right? I'm concerned sometimes about how are we, where this idea of different narratives would lead us, right? François Lyotard, which is one of the biggest postmodernist philosophers who started with this idea of different narratives, and the postmodernism, it's the end of the big narratives, at least in the Western world. And he was also saying that at a certain point, when there are a lot of different narratives, you cannot create consensus, and therefore you cannot have a common destiny as a group, as a civilization, as humanity, as whatever you want. You at a certain point needs to co-create a certain narrative. And of course, I know anybody has the answer on how this new narrative is to be created, but also I'm focusing on the question, to what extent this new trend of identifying individuals with the narratives or their background, of their cultural background, may or may not influence negatively the possibility to create a common narrative, which will allow us to move forward this growing tension between the different narratives in today's societies, especially in the West, of course.
Yeah, great question. And I would say at first, being from Argentina and living in France is tough for you football season, man.
Well, we got them several times on the rugby side, so it's fine. They are really hurt on that side. We are really hurt on the football side, so let's call it even.
Yeah, it's an amazing rivalry. But to answer or to at least attempt to explain a little bit about how I think about that. Because I think your question is a well-placed one, and it's a nice, like, broad question. I mean that in a good way, because it has nuance. Here in the United States, that has been boiled down to this idea of, like, identity politics, right? It's now a new story that they're saying, like, you know, oh, it's all about identity politics, right? And I think what's interesting, again, in order to contextualize, is, you know, those stories that Foucault and others are talking about, I'm like, well, those are defining identities as well, but you're more comfortable with identities being defined as long as there's hierarchy, right? So if the dominant culture kind of making the rules, then it's, oh, we've made, if you think about that concept, right, they've made their identity the default. So the minute you think about, oh, France, what are you thinking about, right? That image is now the default. And or when people think American, right, they think they have a default picture in their mind, and anything else is now measured against that default. What I'm trying to push back against, and I think what others are pushing back against, is the hierarchy of that, right? Because if you've made and institutionalized rules that have made the dominant default the thing to which everything else is measured, now we're just trying to say, or folks like me, and maybe they're putting it more eloquently, is like, I gotta push to have an equal footing with the default, because you've made all of your messaging against my existence, right? So if you, in the 80s, we're talking about welfare queens and getting rid of the welfare state and all these ideas, the branding of that is me. The default of all of those things that we're protecting is you being the sense of the dominant culture, which is white, right? My life is already used to brand by identity. I'm trying to change that brand story, me and others, right? So I think it's had identity politics, right? It's just they're more comfortable with the identity being the default of, you know, Western canon, right? I'm saying that canon ain't the default, because there's other places that are thinking about things differently. They're writing things differently. They've always done that, right? If we're starting the conversations with what the Greeks and Romans said, that ain't really accurate. How we get to that is the default philosophy and logic. Like, what are you talking about? These folks couldn't even count, right? 0 and 1 are ideas that came from Africa and the Middle East. So, those things don't make sense, you know? And that's what I'm pushing back against, right? Is like when I was in Mexico and we're at the pyramids, people understood deep science and math. Why are they the ones that are primitive, right? We build things in America where things flood, and then every year we wonder, why are they flooding? Because we're not in unison with the natural world. Those places have always flooded. right? And people who were indigenous knew we shouldn't live there. But now we turn around and we're like, yeah, we're going to build farms and houses. Every year I turn on CNN and they talking about it's flood season. Everything in Iowa is underwater. I'm like, yeah, dummy, because you're not living in the natural world should be, because we think we can control those things. All those things to me are part of like fighting against these dominant paradigms and unranking them in a way, because they don't really make sense. So it's not really a deep, like, it's just saying they're making the same argument. They just want their hierarchy to be on top. And I'm trying to make de-hierarchy that. It's not a word, but you know what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, well, it is a word. It is a word now. So thank you, Marcus. And that's a fantastic answer. I think I love the idea. And again, in anthropology and in sociology, that we learn to demythologize our world, because you can't grapple with culture, you can't adjust, you can't make changes if we don't understand the pieces like Phillip's talking about are really the way that it's happening, and that our minds see it as a reality that could be very different, and in many ways should be very different. Like, just because we created a technology like the pyramids or whatever, right, doesn't mean that we should have, and the labor that was used to have to build those and the meaning that it had in that system and that structure or whatever, it doesn't mean that it should have been that way. It doesn't mean that was the best for everybody, or that it couldn't have been different, or that all of that labor and all of that time and all of that sweat and death and blood couldn't have built something different.
Yeah, I mean, there's a book I use in presentations. I'm gonna butcher the word, the title exactly, but it's something like the Atlas of Lost Maps or Wrong Maps or something like that. If anybody watches like a presentation I've done, I refer to it quite often. It's a beautiful book, but it's filled with all these like old navigational charts and stories and maps about these places that literally never existed, right? Like El Dorado and the Youth, or all these islands and archipelagos, and people used to sail by, right? They were like, oh yeah, these are accurate. And then it's like, no, they weren't, right? Like some of these places literally never existed, and we are still in all of those types of maps, right? Like we believe the sun revolved around the earth, right? Like that was science, right? We used to put leeches on people, right? We used to bleed them out, like all of these things. And, Ursula Le Guin's better than me, right? She said at one point we believed in the divine rights of kings. If you talk to a serf in 13 anywhere in Europe, their life was the king was divine. I lived on the land of a lord whose right to my life was bestowed upon a holy figure as represented by the king. Now you have that same conversation. People are like, what the hell are you talking about? That's absurd to think. We can tell ourselves other stories as well.
Yeah, that's
These
fantastic.
stories are not written in stone.
Yeah.
So these ideas of hierarchy, these ideas of scarcity, none of them are true. They're all choices. They're all stories. And we just have to emphasize and tell different ones.
I love that, man. And I think, and we keep coming back to that, I think that's the takeaway. We put on the chat on the side connections. Hopefully these are all good ones because they're public ones.
Yeah.
So that you're good with those.
Yeah.
So LinkedIn, we've got your website there and other ways to connect. Read his stuff, like it, follow Phil McKenzie, publicize him, invite webinars, your own chats. We got to keep talking, and I hope that there's this open space to do this. So thank you so much for coming. Thank you so much for sharing. Thank you, the rest of the panelists and guests.